Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Getting Started with Evidence-Based Practice, a practical guide for health and safety managers. I'm Ben Evans, Director of Product Marketing and Customer for HSI Safe, and joining me today on the call is Ben Hutchinson. Ben's a senior safety practitioner, researcher, podcaster of the podcast Safe As, and blogger who translates safety science into practical insights. If you're health and safety leader on LinkedIn, I'm sure you've come across Ben's posts around evidence-formed approaches to health and safety. When I first started in the industry, it was one of the primary sources that actually got traction, and Ben was very kind to answer some of my questions in direct message as well. And it sort of got me started around looking at how do I answer questions around what does the evidence say for certain approaches in health and safety. And it's a pleasure to finally have Ben on the webinar today. So thanks, Ben, for joining us.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the invite. Hey, everyone.
So let's start with it. Evidence-based approaches. What's the reason why for someone coming into this thinking like, why does it matter? Why should I start here, and how can I actually, get the sense of why this is important?
Yeah, it's kind of a tough one, I think, when we have these silos, and silos are very normal. It's a very human thing to set up silos. We've always done it as social animals, but there very much is a barrier between research communities and practitioners. And I think that part of it is, unlike perhaps modern engineering or modern medicine, which very much do have their own bodies of knowledge, they're very established, like engineering, and I'm very thankful for this. But engineering logics and judgments are based generally on very sound, tested principles, sound physics and maths. I'm really thankful for that, because planes generally stay in the sky because they obey the laws of physics. Whereas safety practice, it's really, I think, only been more of a modern change where we've become more based around, or to a degree, theory. Most of the profession, most of the domain of safety practice, it really has been on the tools. Certainly when you go back to the turn of the century, like the 1900s, 1910, like when they talk about sort of the safety officers, they're very much people who came from the tools, who know the tools, who are out there every day. They're more of akin to a supervisor. But the times have changed to a degree. So I think one of the key I think some of the key value of reaching out to the evidence is there's this huge world that's sitting out there, and in some areas, very sophisticated data around the things that we do. And really, I go back to this question around, how do we know what we do actually works? And you don't always have to do that stuff yourself. Like, there actually is quite a lot of research and evidence around what seems to work and what seems not to work. And when doesn't approach like a toolbox. What do we know about toolboxes? When do they tend to work? When don't they tend to work? So I think research can really help open up more possibilities around to understand when these sort of approaches can and may not achieve their goals. And you don't have to go through those steps yourself.
Yeah. And I guess if you're not going through those steps, you can fall back on habit, sacred cows, the things that intuitionally you may have done in the past that feel right, but it's not really been maybe had the litmus test yet to actually understand, is this actually doing what we think it's doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll give you an example. Like, there was a recent study, in the last 12 years, let's say. And what it looked at was, what does a safety investigator actually focus on during an investigation? Based on the sort of sacred cows, the things that we think we're doing, we think we're looking for objective facts in the world. We think that we're crafting improvements that directly talk to those facts. And the investigations probably could be better, but we think they're probably fairly effective. Because why else would we do them? When you actually go to the research, though, most of those assumptions don't necessarily hold very well. And we're talking across multiple industries, multiple organizations from different parts around the world. That's not saying your investigations, the people sitting here right now, aren't achieving those goals, but we know that the investigators' background, how they believe causality occurs strongly influences the things that they construct. They're not necessarily finding like objective facts out in the world. They're constructing their meaning around them. So I actually saw this today on LinkedIn around an aviation accident, and investigations are purely fact-finding. It's not about interpretation. But when you really unpack that, the things that they actually include in the investigation by necessity has to have some social element to it. Why are they picking like objective fact A rather than objective fact B? And they'll say objective fact B is out of scope. Why? It's almost certainly some sort of social, political reason why factor B isn't included. Now, don't get me wrong, there will be sound engineering reasons why factor B wasn't included sometimes also. My point is, we think that our processes are really objective, but evidence suggests they're probably not as objective in some of the ways that you actually expect. So that study, I got a bit derailed on that one, but that study in particular, they found that the things that the investigators are fixing, the corrective actions or the improvements, aren't very strongly connected to the sort of causal facts. They end up fixing the things that are easy to fix, the things that they were going to fix anyway, the things that they're sort of allowed to find because they'll get grilled by the project manager, things they can afford to fix, the time that they have to fix it. The point is, like you mentioned, the sacred cows, research can be a really good way to sort of cut through and critically evaluate why we do what we do, because it may not be directly connected to your daily work as you think it is.
Great. So I just say as well, if you'd like to ask Ben a question throughout, we take them as we go. So just hit the little QA button at the top and ping him your questions.
Yeah, actually, just on that, instead of me just yapping away, like I'd be more than happy to spend more time answering questions. So we'll try and I'm happy to move through sort of my material pretty quick and open up more time to chat.
Yeah, so if there's any spicy ones or potentially as well, you're somewhere on your journey actually wanting to take an evidence-informed approach to health and safety in your organization, like Ben's a great soundboard, like I said, so feel free to try and challenge him.
Please, nothing on risk matrices. I just can't.
Accept that.
I just can't do it.
That's the only caveat. Everything else is fine. Okay, so if we're thinking then around the barriers that people commonly face though, Ben, like what do you find are some of the biggest barriers that you hear that stop health and safety people from taking more of an evidence-based, evidence-informed approach within their organization?
Yeah, look, there seems to be a lot of factors, and there is some research on this too. I think one of the main barriers is just being able to access the information. So probably back up a little bit. The first one is knowing that information is there. I think probably most people realize that there is a lot of research, broadly speaking. So knowing what to access, where to access it, and why you would access it. The research community certainly hasn't made it easy to access the information. Now that isn't to do with the researchers. You could reach out to your local uni and give them a grilling, but it's all wrapped up in money. The people that publish it are the big publishing journal, like your Elsevier's and whatnot, and they want to make money. They love rolling around in cash. So to do that, they lock things up behind paywalls. And then therefore, it's really a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the people or organizations that have money for the research to actually access it tend to be the university libraries or the databases. So then it's researchers who have access to it, so they continue to use it. So one is knowing that it is a huge constraint, but there are some ways to get around it to a degree. And we'll cover some of that later. The second one I think is relating to what I said earlier around look, I'm going to get grilled over this one. I'll call it a profession just through simplicity, but whatever you want to call it, the safety domain, the field, the profession, whatever. It still is very much from the tools. Now, you may not be a Sparky yourself, but typically our domain has been focused on, bodies of knowledge have been very focused on less theory and more practice. So the other side of it is knowing, why would you even want to go to research? Like, what's it going to do to help you practically? Your job, you're a site safety advisor on a construction project. You know, you have your list of objectives you have to do for the month. It might be in a spreadsheet. You have to attend the pre-start, do the drug and alcohol, you do investigations, you do daily walkarounds, and you might do observations and whatnot. how research fits into that doesn't necessarily flow. Like, at what part of that would you actually need research? You know that engagements work because the fact that people talk to you and they tell you about hazards. So I think that the value of it doesn't necessarily flow. I think those are two very strong sort of persistent barriers. The reason why I emphasize the sort of practical element is if you take medicine, engineering, nursing, like ergonomics, human factors, these are professions that all started the same way. Like, in fact, surgeons and medical doctors were a totally distinct field. And surgeons were very practical. Like, they literally cut things off. They yanked out teeth. They didn't have medical backgrounds necessarily. It's only more of a semi-recent sort of change in medicine where they sort of combined, and it was really heavily based around evidence-based practices or evidence-informed. Engineering the same. Like, you look at engineers from 100 years ago, or probably a bit longer, they were usually self-taught sort of polymaths that could do physics and maths. They understood general sort of physics. But it wasn't until later they had their own sort of very developed body of knowledge. And we don't tend to have that in the safety domain like other fields. Certainly in the UK and the US, they're closer to that place. And in Australia, if you're based in Australia, the AIHS does have some body of knowledge, but it's not the same as engineering. You do engineering anywhere around the world, and there'll be differences, but generally the underlying principles are very similar around physics and whatnot, engineering logics. We'll probably never get there in safety because there are no simple laws of safety. That doesn't mean there aren't principles of engineering and psychology and social psychology, et cetera, and organizational sort of work, but it's not quite as clear to have your 10 foundational principles in safety, and we'll probably never get to the same degree. But the point is, you'll see most, at least developing countries around the world, most Western developed countries in the world, the safety profession has sort of upskilled. So what was originally someone from the tools has upgraded to sort of like a Cert 3 is the minimum, then Cert 4. And you start to see it now in particular industries where the bachelor is the minimum. And that's part of the general shift to professionalize the industry. That doesn't mean things are getting better, doesn't mean people are more knowledgeable, but certainly the body of knowledge and the foundational principles that they expect of a safety person is expected to be different, more nuanced. And I think that's one of the key selling points of why you might want to be better evidence informed around what are the minimum expectations expected of a safety professional.
So the question here from Troy Walker, I agree with bridging research with practice as best as we possibly can. This might sound ridiculous, but what would, in somewhat of a nutshell way, describe a health and safety manager? I find the two terms are somewhat separate and don't always intersect. In addition, and as part of the safety area, my concern here is that the state and or national legislation often drives what managers can actually do, and it's often unclear and uses legal jargon that seems to confuse a lot of people actually working in the industry. So, Ben, also, what role then do regulators and policymakers play in also shaping evidence-informed safety practices, along with what Troy said?
Yeah, that's really beautiful reflections, Troy. Now, I'm not going to pretend I have the silver bullet, black, white answer for that, but something I do find really interesting is some of the research, particularly industry research, what they've found, or at least what it suggests, is most of the stuff that we do in organizations in the name of safety doesn't come from regulations. It's not red tape, it's blue tape. We've self-created most of the stuff we do with good intentions, right? It's really difficult when you do an investigation, let's say, to come back with nothing, to say we didn't learn anything new and we're not going to fix anything else. Whether that's very accurate as far as that particular incident, it's really unpalatable for a lot of leaders. So we have to create stuff to do. That's not to say that won't have any value also, but so legislation, when you go back down to the core of it, I'll talk to Australia and WH has the harmonised legislation. It's not overly prescriptive. And certainly highly recommend everyone, if you're interested in this broader area, check out Greg Smith's work, the safety lawyer in Australia, Paper Safe, and his more recent book, someone would just yell it out, whatever it is, Proving Safety. Greg really nicely articulates, based on case law, what the legal expectations are. And most of the stuff we're doing isn't even meeting the basic legal expectations. And they're not even prescribing heavily what they expect. This is when you get to court and they say, okay, fine, you want to use the ICMM's critical control framework, or you want to use a safety differently, safety two approach. You want to use behavioral safety. Fine, whatever, we don't care. Show us how you addressed the hazards and the resultant risks. How did you know you had proper systems in place to actually effectively manage those risks? Let's look at your board reports. What sort of intel do you actually get around the interaction with that risk? Does that system work? Would you even know? They're less concerned around the specific mechanisms and how you go about it. They're interested in how you actually achieved those goals and whether you knew in advance, or because they talk about ought reasonably to have known. It was a reasonably foreseeable risk. It's known in the industry, it's in the code of practice. We didn't tell you how to go about it apart from, like a confined space permit. They only prescribe a few things really and harmonized. Not talking about your major hazard facilities and regulated industries, but broadly speaking. So we've self-created that, but we don't really have a lot of good direct interventional evidence. Now that's not even just research, that's even just practical sort of internal sort of knowledge, bodies of knowledge, but the things that we do are actually delivering on those goals. And you can easily test this. Probably a lot of people on the call will have a critical control framework, something very similar, whatever you want to call it. How do you actually know that that system is effective? How's it actually achieving? Now that may be very similar to your verification process, but it may not. If you actually dig into the verification process, if it's just people, a supervisor ticking yes or no, you have to be prepared to be able to justify why that gave you such confidence. I'm not saying it shouldn't, they probably shouldn't, but you have to be able to justify, because you may be actually in a royal commission or an inquiry defending why you chose to rely on that as direct evidence that the system is working. Now, kudos to you if you can do that, but my point is the legal expectations are pretty low, but they do give us a pretty good sort of true north around what our system should be trying to achieve. I don't know if I even answered your question, Troy, but the regulators definitely play a role, but we've self-created this problem for ourselves. I think that they can play a role, particularly in being more of a, I've seen this approach from some of the regulators where they're more of a sort of a friend, they pat you on the back and come out and help you learn, fine, whatever. And that's separated from the sort of their investigation and prosecution side. I think that's positive. I think the big stick approach, like you've seen Victoria, WorkSafe, I question whether that's the right approach as far as delivering value, but certainly there needs to be some sort of fear around consequences. And I think, so it does have a place. There is some limited evidence that big stick approach has some limited benefits. Certainly there's been research that the more fines and improvement notices they issue, they tend to have less repeat from the same organization. But other evidence has sort of contradicted that too. So the regulators definitely have a role. And I think a key role is to articulate what they expect. So that's why I'm a big fan of codes of practice. The codes don't need to be entirely systematic. They don't need to prescribe in detail, but they give you a pretty good benchmark for what the regulator is going to be using to hold against you. And they'll be using that as part of the particulars of the case, what they charge you. And that's what the courts will have to hold you to. They'll say, based on the accepted knowledge of the industry, it was very reasonable to have fall protection because like everyone knows it, and the code of practice specifically says like that's a reasonable approach. So I think the expectations, what they would expect, are really useful. And this is probably a bit off topic, but this is really interesting. I find that typically, especially in high risk industries like offshore oil and gas, is a really good example, especially deep sea drilling. The regulators typically are very, very far behind the knowledge of the practitioners, like the actual companies doing it. This was remarked in some of the royal commissions, some of the big blowouts, that the regulator was like 10 to 20 years behind industry. They just didn't understand modern processing of deep sea drilling. So they're almost always going to be behind in one sense. So they can't be telling us how to do it, but they can certainly articulate what they're going to use against us. And so I think reverting back again, I think checking out Greg Smith's work and this thing is really foundational for how we should adjust sort of our true north, our compass.
Okay, so might ask you then, Ben, to walk us through a little bit about your process of actually reviewing literature, research. If you've consumed Ben's posts online or gone to his blog, he's a machine and he does the hard work a lot of the time, but teach a man to fish and you can do just what he does yourself. So I might get you to go through that if you like, Ben.
So in the preparation, Ben and I were talking about probably spending a bit of time at the start talking about why you'd want to access literature. I think maybe I got a bit distracted and went off and discussed other stuff, but let's just assume you're already interested, you think you want to access research and that there's a lot of value in doing it. I'm happy to chat offline. One is, like, let's say you're already convinced, how would you actually get to it? So what I'm going to focus on is the practical stuff, like what's my process? And I'll go through a couple of worked examples. So you want to?
Yeah, get it back up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I think that was just product placement for me. My blog's there. So maybe we'll, actually, no, sorry. Okay, so I get this question frequently. How do I do what I do? I started doing this before the large language models were really a thing. Like AI and agentive language models have been around for a long time, but they really exploded in the last few years. So the thing that I do now, I'm still going to keep doing it because it's my process of learning, but it may not be the right thing for you to do because you could literally download the paper, jump onto Notebook LLM from Google, and you could ask it to do all the stuff that I do, and it'll do it in 10 seconds. My main issue with that is that reading the actual outputs, very useful for a very quick, what's the research on toolboxes? Do they actually improve engagement, learning, whatever? It can punch out that stuff really quickly. But if you actually want to understand the underlying logics of the toolbox, then you really need to go to the source yourself, or at least get the LLMs to read it. But so my process is I read the papers. That's something I'm going to do anyway. I highlight the things that I find interesting. And then at the end, all I do is just have a Word document and I just copy and paste the highlights into it. And then I just, from there, I systematically work through each sentence and convert each sentence or paragraph into my writing, what I make of it. It's as simple as that. Like that's my process of summarizing. There's software packages out there that'll literally do it for you on the fly in real time. I'm big on leveraging tools. I just don't find it very good for my learning. Like I find if I use one of the LLMs to do a summary, I have no way of trusting it. Even if I ask it to calculate a confidence margin, like, are you 80% sure you've covered it literally? So yeah, no problems, 80%, 90%. You go back and I just find having to check it. So then you ask it to do direct quotes instead, which is fine, but then you have to verify the direct quotes are direct quotes. So that's okay if you're just doing it personally, if you're an interest, but since I'm publishing it online, I don't go down that path. So I do it myself. Next page. The thing that I recommend if you're really interested in starting to apply evidence-informed practices, and that's not become an academic, but let's say that okay, so here's an example. The ICMM's critical control framework is very popular now. Look, I like it, but there's very little evidence behind it. And that's typical of any new approach or relatively new approach. There's a lot more embedded evidence within organizations. Like, you go to your big mining companies, they probably have much better data than the published evidence around changes they found from it. But from a published, credible, verifiable perspective, there's very little evidence behind it. So evidence can be really useful for understanding what the boundary is of our current understanding of tools and techniques and philosophies. And there's evidence around, I keep talking about toolboxes, pre-starts, investigations. There's generally evidence behind most of these, but there's probably less than you expect. The best place to go that I always recommend is Google Scholar. I recommend you save that onto your bookmark bar. I'll cover some of the ways to search for stuff after, but I get this question all the time. How do I always stay across? So I literally, quite often, I'll get access to a paper before even the author gets the full copy. It's because of Google alerts. Like that's the whole secret squirrel magic behind it. You jump into alerts, you put in the keywords that you're interested in, and every 2 days it'll email you everything that's new that it's indexed. And because this is a web crawler, it goes through literally everything that's available or close to it. and it indexes it. So that's why I've said, like, I'll have journal articles that have literally, the author has submitted a paper, it's been uploaded onto the database, and Google, doing what Google does, it crawls it, it picks it up, and it literally has a link to the article before the author or even that journal database probably even has a formalized link available. It's very efficient for that sort of stuff. So Google Scholar is the first one. Alerts are really cool. So if you're interested in investigations, if you're interested in biases, heuristics, the critical control stuff, you can plug the keywords in. So do you want to go to the next slide? So alerts is what you'll click on. I've gone a bit silly with the alerts. I think I have about 30 of them, but you probably only need one or two. So you'll see there, what's that, 4 examples of some of mine out of the 30. I get a lot of the repeat stuff, so really I probably need to scale it back to maybe 8 or 10 quality ones. But you'll see there an example. I'll go through the Boolean search terms like the ors and ands, which are case sensitive. But that top one is like critical control management, or critical risk, or critical controls, and risk or safety. So that top one, any new article that's released that the Google Scholar indexes, that includes, and you'll see I've got the commas around the words. So that's a direct quote. It's looking specifically for the words critical control management in that order, not just critical control and management out of, let's say, a 10,000 word document. If you don't put them in direct quotes, it'll show you a document that says critical control and management, but that could be anything. So I'm after specifically that order of words, or if not critical control management, it says critical risk, or it says critical controls. Now, if you type in that, you'll get a lot of other, you might get stuff in security, you might get stuff in healthcare, potentially. Critical risk, you'll get stuff in road transport, probably. So I've put in and risk or safety. So it needs to find critical control management, critical risk, or critical controls, and also has the word risk or safety in there. And then you can get more specific around, let's say you get a lot of false positives around that, you get a lot of stuff that's not relevant. You'll see the bottom one there, so on the top image, accident and precursors. That's probably not a very good one. I probably don't get much value out of that, but you'll see I had to add detection, frequency, lane, autonomous with it's got a minus sign on it. That's saying find any papers with accident and the word precursor or warning signs, but don't include it if it has any of those words with the minus on it, because you find all sorts of very like physics articles that are purely like a lab environment sort of thing. So I'll go through those later. The bottom one is what it would look like. You can test the search terms. So you'll type, let's say, safety climate, and I don't want patient safety climate. I don't want road safety climate. So that's just a very easy way to sort of get rid of patient safety and road transport. And you might even find instead of road, it brings up transport. So sometimes you have to very much change it on the fly and then put in transport. But that's sort of the power in it. Now I've put that for the alert, that's to create the alert, but it's the same principles for just searching. What's the evidence of ICAM? And you're not going to find much for ICAM specifically, but let's just humor me. ICAM and effectiveness or something, or investigation and effectiveness. Like put in any search terms that interest you and then see what comes out of it. And then you can finesse it from there. But that's specific on the alerts. Yeah, go to the next slide. I'm not going to labor these, but let's say you, first of all, the good thing about Google Scholar is it tends to find links for stuff that's available. So as soon as you, let's say safety climate, I'm interested in construction safety climate. So I might type just construction safety climate, or I might do construction and remember, and has to be in capitals. And I'll put safety climate in brackets because I don't want climate and safety. I want specifically safety climate, let's say, and construction. In that case, you might actually get construction of a safety climate survey rather than construction industry. So you might have to do construction industry plus safety climate. Anyway, Google Scholar is very good at finding direct links. It'll often find them through ResearchGate. It'll find them directly through the publisher. It'll find them through academia.edu. if you don't have any success with finding it directly through Google Scholar, there's probably a good chance it's not readily available. But it's always worth jumping onto the database. So these ones up on the screen are just random examples of safety, but like Safety Science, Applied Ergonomics, Journal of Safety, Science and Resilience, they're all on Elsevier, Science Direct. But many of these big journals also have open access. And some of the lower tier journals, the lower impact journals, a lot of them have fully open access. So the Journal of Safety, generally fully open access. Open access means it's freely available. So you can find a lot of research free online. These are places you can go to, but I think the first place should always be Google Scholar. Then check Google, just the general search engine. If you don't have any success there, maybe jump to the next slide. I don't know if I have ResearchGate there. All right, so I think this is a wayward slide. But if you're studying at the moment and you cite a lot of stuff, here's a bit of a trick. Let's say you use Zotero or OneNote, whatever it is. If you bring up the study on Google Scholar and you type cite, you can download the citation directly into the software and it'll import it. So I do that for Zotero. It takes RefMan or any of those, and it'll throw it straight in. Another really useful tool here, and this is one that my supervisor, Drew Ray, showed me. I use it all the time. Let's say I'm interested in that first one, failing to fix what is found. Actually, here's a good paper. I've summarized it. But what are some similar papers to that? What else talks about risk accommodation? If you click on the cited by, it says, in that case, cited by 11 studies, there's a good chance you'll find other papers that are on a similar theme because they've referenced that paper to begin with. So it's really useful. So questions like, what's the evidence of safe work method statements? Again, we don't actually have very good evidence of SWMS, but there's some interesting sort of papers around it. You type in safe work method statement, effectiveness or whatever it is, you might get a handful of direct specific studies. But what else is out there? Click on cited by and see who else has cited. There's a good chance you'll find at least one or two more. Obviously, you can go into that paper also, like that Stackhouse paper, and look at their reference list. But the cited by is a really good way of seeing newer stuff that's referred back to it. Yeah, I think that was just a wayward slide that's just sort of snuck in there. So if you roll over to the next slide, that's just the same one I spoke about before. That's where I've clicked on cited by, and they're just some of the ones like how do organizational practices relate to perceived system safety effectiveness, blah, blah, blah. Really good tool. And you'll see that one, that second one down, cited by 44. Like that's got quite a lot of stuff that's referring to it. So if you're interested in organizational practices related to system safety effectiveness and safety climate, it's probably a good chance you'll find something else interesting by clicking on cited by. I haven't got it, it's cropped in this image. But if you go over just a little bit to the right, you'll probably find it's got some direct links to at least one of those. So it's usually pretty good at finding a direct link. And if it doesn't find a direct link, as I said before, there's a good chance you're going to struggle to find it without going down the dark side, which we'll cover next, I think. No. First of all, I mentioned it before around search operators. If you're going to start playing around with Google Scholar, just literally punch in what you're interested in first. If you're interested in ICANN's investigation, just type that in and see what happens. If you don't find what you're after, this is where it's really worth scrubbing up on your basic search terms. Now, Google has an article, has lots of articles around. I covered it before. And or are really the main ones that I use. I'll also use brackets and like quotes. The easiest thing to do, I think, now that we have all these LLMs at our fingertips, is just ask one of like Gemini or ask ChatGPT, how do I type, give me a search term to find research on safety climate in the construction industry without patient safety or something else. It'll tell you exactly what you need to paste into Google Scholar. It might even give you direct links, but they're a little bit shifty. I wouldn't trust them necessarily with actually finding stuff, but they can find it. They're better at it now. But coming up with the search terms, man, they are like, they'll give you the real smoking search terms. So leverage them in that sense. Also, I probably should have pre-prepared this. But there's actual search engines, LLM search engines based around research. Now, let me just, I'll give you the specific ones that I use. So there's Perplexity is pretty good. It's a LLM sort of chat engine, but it's pretty good for research. The one that I really like is called SciSpace, scispace.com. That's SCI space.com. Really easy. You just sign in and you ask it, I need research on the effectiveness of construction toolbox talks. I need research on how do safety walkarounds contribute to sort of negative outcomes? Like, can they worsen safety outcomes? You just type it into that engine. It might ask you a few clarifying questions. Do you mean healthcare studies? Do you mean blah, blah, blah? And it'll give you a whole page of studies, or it'll tell you it couldn't find much direct. SciSpace is really good. Typically, I'll look for myself first, and then I'll check SciSpace after just to see if I've missed anything really interesting. I've mentioned before Notebook LLM, or is it Notebook KLM? Yeah, Notebook LLM, Notebook LLM. It's a really good one for you. You upload the PDF and you can ask it to analyze it for you. It can explain the statistics, like why would they choose a Poisson distribution or a linear regression model? So the good thing about the chat models is that they can really break down this barrier of really esoteric scientific jargon. What are some of the limitations in this study that's more than just what the authors said? Like, can you tell me what some of the limitations of using a linear regression model is, or a Delphi method interview study? And it'll give you some suggestions around where you should be cautious. They're so good at that, expanding your own sort of perceptual horizon. I use them all the time, and sometimes I'll literally get it to explain a concept to me like I'm 5. So break it right down and give me a practical example how, as a safety person, how I can use a linear regression model. Now, I'm not suggesting you do that specific one. Like, I would use it, others may not. But it's a really good way to break down knowledge and applications of research, because it can give you suggestions, and sometimes really good suggestions, and other times it's a bit but whatever. So that's a really good one. Another one that's probably the gold standard so far that I've used is undermined.ai, but I don't have the paid account. I only have the free account, so you only get a certain number. But let's say you have 3 searches a month on undermined.ai. This is the one, unless you pay for the account, this is the one I say for emergencies. Like, I absolutely have to know all of the research that I can find on a very specific topic. This is the one I go to, because this is the one that can really find stuff that even I couldn't find on Google Scholar. And I'm pretty decent at finding stuff, but this one at times can be better, other times not so much, but it's definitely worth your time, and start playing around with them. Where's my screen? Okay, so let's roll on to the next one. Now, this is sort of the meatier part. Let's say you jumped on Google Scholar. It couldn't give you a direct link. For some reason, I didn't have an image of ResearchGate. So ResearchGate, really good site. It's a site where researchers upload their own research. There's usually a decent chance also, if Google Scholar doesn't link to it, you can find it on ResearchGate. Or on ResearchGate, if you find the direct landing page for that article, you can request research from the researchers. And then it's a bit of a hit and miss if they respond with it, but it gives you one avenue. Academia.edu is another good one. That one often has a lot of stuff, so it's worth signing up to. That's free, and there's a good chance you'll find it between ResearchGate, Google Scholar, or academia.edu. Often, the full links that Google Scholar has linked to is from one of those 2 sites. Now, let's say you can't find it anywhere else. This is where you enter the swashbuckling era. Sci-Hub. I can't give the direct link because it's so dodgy. It's like some Russian dodgy site that changes like every month. I'm guessing it's the FBI and the Interpol take it down. Probably not. But yeah, they do change their domains pretty regularly. So let's say it's scihub.io this month. Anyway, it's easy to find. Reddit has a list of all the active sites. Sci-Hub is really good for stuff let's say about a year ago or a year or 2 ago. So let's say anything pre-2022. There's a good chance if you paste the DOI link. So the DOI is a permanent link. So it's not your usual sort of, like your database could be safety science. They register papers through this international organization. and you have a permalink. That's called the DOI. So typically, if you want to use Sci-Hub, you need to go onto the abstract of the article. So you go onto Google Scholar, click the link for the article, and it'll take you to like Science Direct or the journal, Safety Science. Copy and paste the DOI. It'll be https://doi.org/ and a whole bunch of random looking stuff. Paste that into Sci-Hub if it's a few years ago, and you've got a decent chance of getting the full article. The newer one that covers newer stuff is called Anna's Archive. That's the one I go to most now, but that one's still hit and miss. But Anna's Archive, you paste the DOI in, and again, you've got a relatively decent chance of getting articles from a few years ago. It'll hopefully link to a full article. Even dodgier that I don't use that much, not because it's unsafe, but you can question the ethics of it, but Library Genesis, LibGen, has full access books on it. I use this one less because I like to support the authors, but if you're after a book from a past author, that passed away years ago, it's from like the 1970s, whatever, LibGen's really good for tracking down obscure sort of books and things. So you can throw it in there and there's a really good chance you'll find through LibGen. So those three together, after you've already explored Google Scholar, you've explored ResearchGate and Academia, I highly recommend you jump onto Anna's Archive, Sci-Hub, or if it's a book, Library Genesis. All combined, you probably have a fairly decent chance of getting whatever article you're after, probably around that 70 to 80%. The other 20, you probably have to reach out to the author directly if you're that interested.
And also, if you are short on time or getting a foundation in evidence-informed approaches, they can also listen to the Safe As podcast, where you're doing explainers in, what do you reckon, 5 to 10 minutes on a single piece of research. Do you want to explain to people who maybe haven't heard the podcast yet what it is and how they can actually use it for bite-sized insights?
Yeah, let me just, something I didn't cover that I meant to cover, where to start with research. I highly recommend, let's say you want to understand a topic as quickly as possible. Like you understand what's the current state of knowledge around, I'll go back to, let's say, safety climate. Start with something that's called a meta-analysis. It's META-analysis. A meta-analysis is a systematic methodology where they take a large body of the research. If it's a systematic meta-analysis, in theory, they've looked at every relevant study for a topic. But in practice, that's never the case. But and then what they do is they essentially group all of the data together from what, let's say it's 70. Actually, I covered one recently. It covered 77 studies on, I think it was psychosocial or something similar. So essentially, they probably reviewed 2,000 studies. They found 77 that met their criteria to be studied in their study. And they grouped all of the data together and analyzed it as if it was one big study. Meta-analyses are like the gold standard for understanding the knowledge around a topic. You won't find them for everything, but you do find them. There's safety behavior, there's climate, culture, communication, investigations. There's usually meta-analyses for these. So I highly recommend, if you want to really do a crash course 101 on a topic, look for a meta-analysis. Second, you may not find a meta-analysis. The second one to look for is called a systematic review. So if we go back to my search terms from before, I want to know construction, industry, safety, climate. So I'll say in commas, construction industry and capitalized, safety, climate, again in commas, and then I'll have brackets, open bracket, and then I'll have meta-analysis and then in brackets again, systematic review, close brackets, close the, close hyphen, close quotes, close brackets. The reason why you have two words in the same sort of quotation marks is that it groups them together. So what that'll do is that'll look for any study that says construction industry, safety, climate, and it either has systematic review or meta-analysis in the body or the title. So that's my almost 9 out of 10. If I'm looking up a study, which I do all the time, I'm almost always start with those two terms, meta-analysis or systematic review. Now, if I don't find those, that's when I'll drop those and then just search more broadly for something. Highly recommend that's where you start in safety. And the good thing is systematic reviews particularly aren't really dense with jargon. Meta-analyses tend to be very statistical, but systematic reviews can be quite quite palatable for people that are sort of new. They'll still go into details, but they typically will give you a bit of a lay of the land. And they'll say, here's 20 studies they'll discuss. They'll give you a paragraph per study and say, this study found blah, 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 but they didn't find whatever. And then they'll give you a bit of a summary around what do we know and what don't we know. Okay, so my podcast it's based on a few operating rules. And the rules are really just because I can't be bothered with a lot of overhead. I want something really thrifty, quick. So I've set up principles where it's usually based on one study. It's going to be very rarely interviewed, so it's usually me yapping. And I'm trying to fix the total length to somewhere around 6 to 10 minutes. Now, because I've recorded so many episodes in advance, the average length is pushed out to about 12 to 15 minutes now, but I think that'll be about the ceiling. So let's say 15 minutes or less. My goal is not to go in depth with the article. What I want to do is have a very quick crash course to identify. So you listen to it, you're like, what is the research around leadership walkarounds? So my recent one I released looked at a systematic review of leadership walkarounds around what impacts do they have on engagement, on clinical outcomes, etc. Because in, let's say, 6 to 15 minutes, you can't go into a lot of detail. So it's a very high level, but it's pretty good for something you can listen to in the car or when you're going for a walk. They can give you further prompts. I think research is good for crafting better questions rather than answers. Answers are very tough unless you have a huge body of evidence, like a meta-analysis with a lot of high quality evidence. You're not going to find many answers per se. You're going to find prompts for better questions. And questions are really powerful because they give you areas that you need to focus on in your own practice. The evidence from recent meta-analysis suggests that toolbox talks suck at like just general transfer of information. Let's say that's what it says. Kind of does, but they're a bit more kind with the language. Well, then particular areas you need to improve. You need to make it more engaging, or you need to have more ownership, or whatever it is. So the pod gives very high level prompts, but it doesn't go into the details. The details really are focused on my blog, which I have most of the articles in the pod I've already covered on the blog, or you actually need to go to the original article. And that's what I highly recommend is you go to the original article for a topic because they give you a lot of extra context. And I'm not limiting myself purely to empirical sort of studies where they've tested an intervention. I've covered quite a lot of very qualitative discussion type papers because I think there's a lot of value in the sort of questions that they prompt. Like, what's the role of people within a complex system like healthcare or the chemical industry? Are people mostly bad apples? Are they unreliable parts of a system, or are they usually positive capacities? So I've covered sort of social studies that have tried to turn sort of the dial around how we think about people. So it's definitely not a pod purely for robust empirical evidence, but every pod's based on a study. There could be a discussion paper or a conference paper. Certainly they give additional prompts if you go back to their research.
If you haven't heard it, check it out. It's worth a listen. Ben, thanks so much for your time today. Definitely catch Safe As. Or if you need some guidance, Ben's the man to talk to. He's got some great perspectives on the industry and using evidence to improve health and safety. It's been our pleasure to talk to you today. If you need to talk to anyone about how to use data and technology to extend how you're approaching your health and safety, also feel free to reach out to us at DoneSafe as well for a chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attendance today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions and point you in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Ben.